It's such a treat to be back here with all of you. Love to see our BreakLine Apexers here, our alums, and BreakLiners from September, October, November, and our December cohort as well. Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to have you. And Kal, welcome. We're so excited to have this conversation with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me, Bethany, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm super excited to connect with all of you.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, Kal. And as we kick off here, I think that your career is so interesting. You've got this really neat combination of management consulting, really big healthcare companies, and then startups as well. And so I'd love for you to walk us through your path and share more about what compelled you to leave a really great career at a terrific and very stable company, Amgen, to take the leap into earlier stage ventures. So would love to just hear a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. As you mentioned, I'd been at Novartis in a couple of roles, and then at Amgen, and in three very different roles. And the last one there was founding and leading what we called Amgen Digital Health. So one of the early technology-focused business units within a big pharma med tech company. And as you said, Amgen, worth today it's well north of $100 billion company. Making great amount of profit. So in that sense, to your point around stable. And for me, it's an interesting journey because I loved my job there. When I was building that digital health organization, I would always tell my friends, my wife, I have the best job at Amgen, right? Getting to work on this amazing technology that's incredible, opportunity for impact, and getting to build and do this stuff. But the thing that began to really nag at me was I just felt like, as great of a place that Amgen was and great the people were, that I was sort of at a Walmart when people were building the Amazons of the world, right? That healthcare was at this place where technology had changed all these other industries and hasn't changed healthcare yet. And so for me, I just felt this overwhelming desire to go try to build, at a speed and at a scale that you can do, in Silicon Valley, right, and do at a startup that I just feel like was just too slow moving in a big company, and that really is what drove that jump, and sort of pulled me away from the stability.
Mm-hmm. When we were talking about this as we were preparing for the conversation, you described it in terms of not wanting to regret, like not wanting to look back on your life and regret what you hadn't done.
Yeah. It's a great call out. So, when I got to the place where I was at, which was farther along than I'd ever imagined myself to get to, and then I could see ahead. I could see ahead to saying, hey, I just stay in Amgen. It's only a certain number of years before I could have more money than I would need in terms of just supporting myself and my family and to be retired. And seeing that path actually was a little bit scary, because then I sort of saw that I'm going to get there. And then to your point, once I'm there, actually it becomes even harder, I think, to leave. And then you end up in this position that you can actually imagine it. And then you're looking back and say, that was it. I could have, should have, wanted to have done so much more. And so there was this sort of, scary desire, if you will, or sort of a little bit of, a lot of fear. There was like, I would then look back and have regret that I could have, done a lot more and had a much bigger impact and felt a lot more fulfilled. And I think there was an element of needing to be sort of stretched, right? And needing to really feel that I did everything I could to make a difference, particularly, in healthcare, which is where my passion is at.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that you told that story, because I think sometimes when it comes to our careers, we get into this cycle of making fear-based decisions rather than going after what we really want. And so I love the example that you're setting of going after what you really want.
And maybe, do you mind if I add just a little bit on
please.
that one? Because, obviously at BrightInsight, we're constantly recruiting people, and I get pulled into conversations to help, sell the story and tell people about coming here. And then often it's that, right? I have an offer at Google, I have an offer at Tesla, I have an offer at Medtronic, or they're there right now, and we're trying to convince them to come with us. And that's such a natural way to think about it. And I thought about it the same way. at that point. But what I, sort of a friend took me through, right, and I sort of take people through now is that risk reward trade-off is not what you think it is, because when you are good enough to be working at one of these blue chip amazing companies, you will always be good enough to work there. So when you're comparing that startup, and let's say the startup fails, you are not successful there for whatever reason, you don't like the culture, well, they run out of money, it doesn't matter all the things that could go wrong, you actually are going to get experience that will actually make you more valuable and more impactful, and more desired back in the big company, the environment that you were leaving. It's actually sort of, people think they're choosing a path and then the other one closed. It's the opposite. You're actually just opening up a path, and the other one will always be there. And the new path will actually give you experiences, and learnings and a network and everything else that will actually make you more valuable if you ever have to or choose to go back to the path that you were on. And I truly believe that. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you share that story, and it's one that we talk about a lot at BreakLine. I want to move a little bit further into your career. You joined another big company. You joined Flex in an EIR type role, entrepreneur in residence type role, and you soon saw a key opportunity to build BrightInsight. But I thought that was a really interesting way to found a company. I mean, there's it's much more common in Silicon Valley to kind of have the insight and go out and search for venture capital dollars. You actually spun out of a really big company.
Right.
I'd love for you to share more about that experience and what you learned from
Yeah. The credit really starts with the then CEO and leadership team at Flex, because what they saw is, Flex is about $25 billion revenue company here in the Valley. They actually were funded by Sequoia back in the 80s, right? So when contract manufacturing was a new area. And so they're now one of the world's largest third-party manufacturer, and they make everything from the cloud to Xbox to Fitbits and so forth. They're also one of the world's largest manufacturer of regulated medical devices, third-party manufacturer of regulated medical devices. So they were seeing this digital transformation across all these other industries, and they saw that it was going to come, or was beginning to come, to the pharma and medical device industry that they served. I obviously came from that industry. I had done entrepreneurial work because after Amgen, as we mentioned, I went to a Series B startup, Doctor on Demand, and so when they recruited me, they saw that sort of ability to be navigate, be successful in a big company environment and in a startup environment. But for me, the pitch to me was, hey, we have what you said, entrepreneur residence, like take all the capabilities, all of the, the reputation, the resources of Flex, and come build, what you think is going to be a really impactful business here. And so you don't spend all your time, trying to find the money you need to go and just get to that next phase. We will get you until you have really gotten yourself to a point where you validated the business and the business model and the product market fit, and then you can go off into the venture and growth world, right? So we took so that was really compelling to me, the strategy, the logic that they laid out. The other part of it was, coming from the Amgen days, I saw a lot of startups that wanted to sell into pharma, and and it was a real challenge for them because the industry is so risk averse and there's so many regulations and requirements that you can't be the three folks in a garage startup and show up at a major pharma company or a hospital or whatever, the healthcare system, and be credible. And even though some of the ideas that I had and my co-founders that I brought in, that we had, even though we had deep experience between us, between the three of us, we had probably 50, 60 years of pharma med tech experience, or, at least 40, 50. We still needed to be standing on the shoulders of a really legitimate company to do the kind of innovation that we wanted to do, right? So ultimately doing what we did at Flex probably shaved years off of our timeline of both being able to focus on the product itself, the problem and the product and the customer, versus the fundraising in those early days, as well as we got our first customer and second customer, right? Novo Nordisk and Roche, two of the world's most prominent pharma companies. We just would not have won those companies at the speed that we did if we weren't a part of Flex, right? We probably would have had to target small startups and kind of get our chops and prove ourselves in with other small companies before we could ladder up to, a Novo Nordisk, right? But being a part of Flex, we got the ability with a legitimacy because we had their backing and their reputation on the line. So Novo Nordisk took our call. They trusted Flex. They trusted us, right? And so then we really established ourselves, then spun it out. I think it's a really underutilized model for innovation. And with that said, now most big companies kill this type of innovation, right? So Flex really set us up for success. They gave us full freedom. They stayed out of our way, whether that was picking our cloud infrastructure, any of the technology choices we made, how we hired, who we hired, how we paid them, had a ton of flexibility that that you got to really get right to enable this kind of innovation in a traditional big company.
Kal, one of the things that you were talking about was how the fact that you didn't have to raise money freed up so much of your time and
Yeah,
energy. And you actually just recently raised a Series B during what was probably the toughest time to fundraise in the last 100 years.
yeah.
And you wrote an article, you published an article on LinkedIn about this experience. I encourage all of you to take a look at that. But you basically distilled out that experience of fundraising into 5 key lessons. Will you just talk to us informally about what you learned from
Yeah.
that process?
Yeah. So there's a few lessons that we took away from that experience. The first is um, you got to have you got to know your business, you got to know your customers' business, and you have to have conviction of what the long term and the near term is going to look like, right? So you don't have all the answers, obviously, because there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the world. What we did know is we solved a really important problem. We knew that problem wasn't going away for our customer. And we knew that long term, all the trends were pointing to the market size for what we did growing. And in fact, COVID was going to accelerate digital innovation and adoption, right? So all that really pointed to us saying, guys, the long term picture hasn't changed, right? So both us internally as a company and sort of prospective investors, let's recognize that we're in the long term game here, not the short term game, right? We're not stock traders trying to make a dollar on the market. We're building a business that's solving a really big problem needs to be around for years and decades, right? So that view, and then aligning, ensuring that we had that foundational understanding, and then really thinking through scenarios for the short term, right? Which is, okay, fine, we know in the short term there's going to be challenges. Okay, what's the worst case? What are and sort of lay out those scenarios, but not just lay out those scenarios with just sort of put some numbers in the air, but back them up by actual business drivers, right? So we said, hey, our customer base is X. If this customer stays flat, this other customer cancels a couple of projects, this other customer adds at a slower rate, we don't win these new customers, what does that mean for our business? What will that mean for how much money we're going to burn through, et cetera, right? And kind of really scenario that out. So then when you don't know what the right scenario is, and none of those might be correct, but at least now when you're going to the market, you have a real structured way to present how your business might evolve through this uncertainty. The second and probably most important point I'll highlight is it took us a couple of weeks. Everything was moving fast. It took us probably a couple of weeks or a month to really get to this. But all the investors were saying they were open for business because they wanted to keep having meetings and stuff. But what we learned to do was really push and figure out who are those folks that are really focused on just kind of shoring up their existing portfolio and focusing there, and are really, really cautious to deploy any capital until they know until they had more certainty on the market. And then there was those investors that were much smaller, especially in those early days, that were truly actually open for business. And I'll tell you what, those investors, there's a saying, right? Like when there's uncertainty and like the market crashes, like that's when then the smart buyers come in, right? And I think there really was an element of that, right? Which is like there was a small number of investors who sort of saw how we saw, right? Which is, hey, look at the long-term picture, look at the fundamental problem that's being solved. What's the opportunity for a company to solve that problem? Does this company really know what they're doing? Do they have the right team? Do they have the right product market fit? If you put all those, then all that short-term stuff is just noise, right? That's all just sort of, are you worth this much or that much? But it doesn't fundamentally change, or do you need this much money or that much money? But it doesn't fundamentally change the opportunity. You either believe this market is real, the team is really good, and their product market fits there, they're going to invest, right? So we learned to pretty quickly screen out that. And so we would ask questions like, hey, how many term sheets have you put out in the last couple of weeks, right? How many diligences are you doing right now, right? Tell me, what is it going to take you to get to the investment committee before, so you start to ask those questions, not in an arrogant way, right, but in a fact finding way. And and then and that sort of forced people to to go beyond, we're open for business, to either showing you a path to an actual term sheet that would result in a close, or sort of saying, hey, that's unlikely to get there. So I know there's some other ones, but I would I'll sort of stop after those couple of key ones.
I think that you're raising such an important point. One of my mentors often says money comes with faces attached when he's talking about an entrepreneur's decision to partner with investors. And at BreakLine, we have 7 investors. They've been with us for many years. We absolutely love them, and we're so lucky to have them. But Kal, I didn't tell you this. Stanford asked me to come back and run this kind of class with an investor, and it was sort of a role play. But he was a VC. I was at the very beginning stages of building BreakLine. And he said, Bethany, your job is to separate me from my money. And I was like, I can just tell right now that we are not a good team. We are not
Yeah.
on the same page.
Yeah.
And I think we, as entrepreneurs, we sometimes forget there's a lot of choice out there. You have a lot of choice, and
That's
it's
right.
such a crucial decision. So I'd love to hear how thoughtful you all were about it.
Yeah. And people, look, I'll sort of highlight 2 things that I've, that we've all heard, and I just have a different appreciation of now, actually, being a, VC and growth equity funded company, which is, one is, there's a ton of capital out there, right? People always say there's no shortage of money, and that is actually true. Doesn't mean it's easy to get, but all that does is really forces you to really figure out, are you solving a really big problem? Do you have a path, do you have a path to a value proposition that can let you capture that? Do you really have a good team? Do you really have a good product and product market fit and all that stuff, right? So it forces you, because once you have all that, then it's the opposite problem. You're actually sort of discerning through what's the capital I want and I don't want, right? Which comes back to your point around fit. So that, again, it sounds counterintuitive, and I don't mean to at all suggest that it's easy. It is not. But it is true. If you have, all those pieces in place, there's plenty of people who are searching for great companies, right? And and I forget if it was Mark Andreessen or Ben Horowitz who said this, but one of them said, like, a VC's job is to give away money. So if you can't convince them to give you money, like, how are you going to convince customers and others to do that, right? So it's sort of good to keep that in mind, right? And then that also builds confidence in you as an entrepreneur, right? When you show up, you got to have confidence about what you're doing, right? And that says a lot. The second piece is, you do have to choose your partners wisely, right? And I know that you talk to a lot of people, right? It's even, it's as crucial as hiring, if not more crucial than hiring, because in hiring, it's much easier to part ways if you made a mistake, right? I mean, the 2 biggest decisions you make, I think, as an entrepreneur in that sense, from a people sense, is who are your co-founders and who are your investors, because those are the hardest relationships to part with, if ever, and they have a tremendous impact, on what you build, how you build it, how much you enjoy it, your chances of being successful, right? So you got to get your co-founding team right, and you got to bring that same level of scrutiny to whose money you take, because they will have an outsized impact on whether you're successful or not, and again, how much you enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Um, Kal, I love your personal story too, and I wanted to get into that a little bit because I think it will also resonate with some of the breakliners here. Your father is a dentist, and he was the first in his family to graduate from college. And he and your mom immigrated to the US with you all from India. And you talked about how his family, he came from a long line of farmers in India. Um, and you were a young child when you all got here. And subsequently, your parents also had your brother as well. Will you share a little bit more about that experience, of that childhood experience of moving to a new country, getting
Yeah.
reestablished here, and how that experience shaped your own perception of risk and self-actualization as well?
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that. So yeah, just adding a little bit of color to what you said. yeah, classic immigrant story. Dad, both my parents grew up, fairly poor. I would say very poor, right? Not sort of full meals most days. And so my dad wanted to break out of that. So he, got himself through college and then ultimately dental school. And then when he, the US at the time was giving out visas for dentists because there's a shortage in the US. So he was able to get one of these visas. He actually came by himself because he didn't have money for my mom and I to come with. So he came by himself. I was a year old, and then my mom and I came about 11 months later or so. So that you can imagine that decision for him. But then we all came, and then my parents did again the classic thing. They had both had minimum wage jobs. They sort of split, who did the morning, who did the evening shift or overnight shift, and it took my dad I think about 4 or 5 years to ultimately get through, some additional dental classes here and the exams and so forth to get his dental license. And then, they, as you said, they had my brother there. So we're 8 years apart because it sort of separates them, sort of having me doing that transition, getting themselves established here, and then feeling, financially comfortable enough to have a second kid. And so I remember a lot of being, very, both poor as well as not fully integrated into the country, right? So I didn't know any English until I started kindergarten because we just lived with other people from India that were, the state that we were from, Gujarati, and that's where my parents speak. So that's just how so I got to kindergarten, right, to learn English, even though I'd been in the U.S. for a few years at that point, right? And then we moved from the city to the suburbs in Chicago. And so I started in third grade, and I was in special education sort of courses because they were like, well, you don't know how to write cursive and you don't know how to read very well and stuff like that, right? And then by sixth grade, I was in the honors track, but like, kudos to the school system there to like sort of catch me where I was, and then sort of support me through that journey. But I remember things like my mom, sharpening pencils with a knife instead of the 10 cents, right? I didn't realize this, but we would, our one treat a month was going to Pizza Hut, and we would bring our own Coke. And so it just never occurred to me that like, that's actually not what you do at a restaurant, right? But my parents didn't know any better. They were immigrants, and they're like, why would we pay whatever Coke costed? It was just like today, it's, probably cost 3 or 4 times more, right, at the restaurant than at the store, and probably the poor person at Pizza Hut was, uncomfortable telling my parents that they weren't allowed to do that. So those types of things really, sort of shape, both the work ethic piece, obviously, but to your point, it really shaped the risk part, right? And so if I think about what my parents did, which still, I think about my parents today, they seem so complacent and risk averse, but at the time, like, here's my dad, got himself out of poverty, had just established himself at a medium-sized city in India as a dentist. So he was probably like just rolling in money compared to what he knew. And then he's like, took this immense risk decision to leave all that behind, including my mom and I, to immigrate to America, that he just literally didn't know anybody except like friends of friends, and stayed with, people he had never met before, taking a job that wasn't obviously being a dentist, right? So I'm like, that is way bigger risk than me leaving Amgen and trying to start a company. I mean, that's nothing. Like, I have, a rich network. I have an education. I have all these things to lean back on. I can get another job in a week, right, and go back to making money if whatever I'm doing sort of hits a wall, right? And so it's definitely sort of it shapes in a big way, right, what real risk is. And the impact of that risk, because for my dad to have come and sort of failed in America, that implication would have been so massive. And in some ways, maybe that was his Amazon, Walmart thing, right? He had gotten to being a dentist that he probably strived for, for years to get out of poverty. And he probably was like, is this it? Like, I can be a dentist for the next 50 years in India and be fine, but like, what's America like? I hear amazing things. Like, that's really sort of going to the next level of opportunity, right? So yeah. Anyway, that's sort of the story. Happy to add any more color to it. But.
I love this story so much. I have so much respect for your dad and your parents and the choices that they made. You never, so I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions. When you left your very secure corporate job to pursue a more entrepreneurial path, how did your parents react to that?
Yeah. It's an interesting reaction. So they were, they definitely were not, what are you doing? Don't do that. Doesn't seem like a good idea. But they were also sort of a little bit inquisitive about, so wait, how much do you make today, and why, like just the logic of like you're trying to move up, the salary ladder, and so why would you so that whole sort of notion was confusing to them. And that, again, notion of like, well, yeah, I'm just a big great company, like what problem are you trying to solve, right? And but at the end of the day, I think they just have a deep intrinsic trust in me that I'm thoughtful and making good choices. And even if they don't understand it, there's, that I've probably thought deeply about it. And so, kudos to them for having that. And obviously kudos to my wife for supporting these types of decisions, because obviously there's a big implication, right? When you go from being it's not just the financial side, there's obviously a work-life balance implication to being an entrepreneurial, company versus, an established one, right? And so yeah, it was, but I think as we were prepping for this call, I think I pointed out, like, and I just alluded to, again, right now I'm almost like wanting to shake my parents, like, why don't you do more? Like, you're retired, you have all this time on your hands. I mean, put COVID aside, like you could be doing A, B, and C. Like, yeah, we're happy. I'm just like, wait, are you the same people that immigrated, took this amazing sort of risk and journeyed out, and now you're like, going to Italy is just too much work. I'm like, what happened? Like, so I want to make sure I don't lose that, that I have the same spirit in me when I'm, 70. But yeah, deep respect and support from them always.
And also, I mean, as you're telling that story, like part of what I love about where they are right now is they're satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think Americans underestimate how wonderful it is to
Yes.
just be satisfied, and
Yes.
kind of calm with
Yes.
the state of your life. Like that's an amazing place to be.
That is true. And I actually, and my wife ran to me, and I do actually point that out when we sort of have the frustration. He's like, hey, no, step back. They are just happy. I mean, like, why are we trying to rock the boat? They're just like, hey, we're great. Like we don't, there's nothing else we're trying to go after, right? So you're right. That's the other side of that coin, is that is very American, right? To have some element of things can be better, right? It's not just about the money, right? But just whatever improvement in your own self and the people around you, the world around you. And I mean, that's a whole conversation in itself. I don't know if there's sort of a right answer on it there for me, but I think well, maybe I'll just say this about it. I mean, I personally strive to be, it's sort of what is it, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle or whatever. I'm probably quoting the wrong thing from my chemistry days, but like, is how do you have both at the same time, right? Like, how are you actually really content with who you are and where you are, but at the same time you are, have a desire and a motivation to do better for yourself, meaning develop yourself and who you are and the world around you, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's probably the ultimate goal to achieve.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, so let's pivot and talk about Bright Insight, and I want to share a couple of things with our audience before we dive in here. And this will be last formal question from me, and then we'll turn it to questions from our attendees. So thank you, Juan, for adding one, and feel free to add more, folks. So Kal, Bright Insight, LinkedIn top startup. You recently announced your 100th employee. You were named to the CB Insights Digital Health 150. CEO Magazine named you as a top 20 dynamic CEO. I mean, this is wonderful traction and momentum. And so I'd love for you to share more about how the company has grown and evolved over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it is, I mean, appreciate you sharing that. Um, it's been a fun ride, right? And it's been a exciting ride and a fast one, right? So, that's really a function of, really the team that we've been able to put together. And, one of the key things we talk a lot about, even as we've been growing really fast. So just to put it in context, we celebrated 100 employees in August. We're like 160 today. So 60%, whatever that is, right? 60% growth in the last quarter, right? And over half of our employees have been, well over half our employees now have been hired since COVID started. So I literally haven't met them in person. None of us have met each other in person, right? Which is also pretty crazy. So when we did our Series B fundraising that, we talked about earlier, And I sort of went to the company with it. I said, look, here's what that means for us. Here's all the things we're going to go do, right? Because we have the money now for this next phase of growth. But I said, but just as importantly, there's things that are not going to change, right? So here's what's going to change. Here's not going to change, right? And one of those was around strategy, but the other one was around the bar we hold for hiring. Even though our velocity of hiring is going to go up a lot, we cannot change the bar for hiring, because that's so key to the success that we've had, and the continued success that we want to have is foundationally. I think you see when you start sort of bending the curve on culture and values and quality of hire, think about the loop that creates. Then other people that you're working with, we've all been in job environments like this, right? Which is, you're on a team and you're like, well, but not everyone's sort of there, something's missing. And so then that brings your game down or your motivation down, right? And then that brings the next person's motivation or game down. And then the person you're interviewing, who is a rock star, isn't going to come in, because through the interview process, it's going to be obvious that, hey, this is a team of B players. And so you can't recruit rock stars into a team of B players. And then you create that downward spiral, right? So for us, it's so important, even with this growth, to really ensure that we don't compromise on quality of the folks that we bring in, right? And then it's all the growing pains that you would expect, right? Like, how do we, we've spent 2020 for us has been the year of, and we said it in January when we kicked off the year pre-COVID, that 2020 is about building for hyper growth, right? So we got to build all the infrastructure to scale really fast. So that's in our core platform, that's in our delivery teams, but that's also in like our finance organization, right? Like, how do we get invoices out, in a scalable way? Like, how do we pay our bills in a scalable way? It's in recruiting. We've quadrupled our internal recruiting team, right? Okay, how do we actually have a process for recruiting? How do we put recruiting IT infrastructure in place? How do we do onboard, right? So whether it's all those kind of quote unquote small things to like the core product itself, we've spent this year, growing fast, but also heavily investing in that infrastructure. So we actually see even more growth ahead for us, certainly from like a customer and customer project and revenue perspective, right? In the coming years, that velocity should actually be able to go up even more, because we're doing this foundational stuff. And then look, we've invested a lot on the people side. So not just hiring the people, but on the people side, right? So whether that, and obviously COVID and virtual has shaped that, right? So we have things like, pretty early, we instituted a mental health day off every month for the whole company, right? So we'll pick a Friday and everybody takes it off, because what I've learned from my experience is, unless everybody has the same day off, it's almost useless to take a day off, because your email and your Slack and your text and everything else is blowing up anyway. And nobody remembers that you have the day off. And so, you're just, the work piles up and then you're making up for it, right? But if everybody tries to take the day off, and look, I'll be honest, not all of us always pull the whole day off, but a lot of people do, and a lot of people get a half day off or not, but at least sort of that whole throughput goes down. And so people can get a break, right? We brought in, Headspace super early on and made that available to the whole company, right? We, brought in external speakers, experts on from COVID to, some of the things that were happening, that are very real and material even today around, with BLM and other, areas around obviously diversity and inclusion, et cetera. So we, tapped our networks and brought in folks to help for us to listen and learn and be connected with folks, right? We moved to weekly all hands for a long time there. Office hours, a lot more sort of just connecting one-on-one with people across the company, right? We added this cool thing called Donut, which every week you randomly get assigned to somebody for coffee. So, so every week, for no reason than just because the algorithm told me to sit down and make 20 minutes to talk to somebody, but we all do it in the entire company, right? So just what a great way to meet people, especially as we're growing fast, but also to stay connected when we don't have the office and the water cooler and stuff, right? We now, we opened a European delivery center without an office, so we have 25 people in the UK now, growing fast, right? So we've sort of thought, about, and by the way, we looked at a lot more than what we've implemented, so it hasn't been sort of just throw spaghetti, but we sort of, we have a culture club that also takes a big role, which is purely voluntary based, like people who care about this, who want to, identify and bring in these types of ideas or solutions to build, camaraderie, right? So we've done all sorts of, other virtual wine tastings, to celebrate our 100th employee and stuff like that. So we spent a good amount of time, because because our whole notion is, if it's sort of the pyramid, right? Like, especially with COVID and all the sort of the higher level of distress in our lives, like if you don't feel sort of safe and secure, and you don't feel safe and secure about your family and your loved ones around you, you are not going to focus and bring your best to work, right? You're constantly going to be distracted and worried, right? And I have that happen to me on days right now. Like, I actually just went downstairs before this and said, hey kids, hey everybody, please don't come upstairs. I don't want to be distracted on this, but I have other Zooms. I'm on a customer call and somebody walks, or, you whatever, or there's something going on in the house. It distracts me from my job, right? We're all human. So we try to invest heavily on how can we support people so that they feel, sort of safe, secure, about themselves and their health and their families. That's the only way they're going to focus at work, right? And so it's not just like the right thing to do, but it's actually the smart thing to do. To really, create an impact, create an environment where people can have full impact.
I love that answer, and one, I think Kal answered your question as he was describing all of these various efforts. And what I think is so interesting is that um, the initiatives that you were sharing with regard to employee engagement are also set up to scale as you all
Right.
scale. These are not things
Right.
that you're going to have to redo, when the company hits 200 and 300 employees. So I think that's really cool. And I also think it's amazing that you all are this sophisticated with regard to your company culture this early in your life cycle as a company. So kudos to all of you. Diane has a question, and Kal, her question is related to the idea that especially some venture capitalists, I think, share, which is there are different types of CEOs, and there's the startup CEO, there's the turnaround CEO, there's the CEO at scale, and it's unusual for all of those things to be one person, for one person to have the interest, for one person to have the expertise. She's wondering, at what point in BrightInsight's life cycle will you continue to be the right person for the job? Like, how do you even think about that?
Yeah. Yes, that's a great question. Hopefully, we'll be, successful enough where that will be, a relevant question. But it's a really good one. So look, I'll answer it this way. I don't have a line in the sand that says when we hit this many people or this much of revenue or this much of value or whatever it is, and then it'll be somebody else. I'll be either bored or I won't be good enough for it, or whatever it is. But what I do, the way I think about it is, the CEO of the company has, a huge responsibility for both, first and foremost, for the fact that all the employees, they've made the biggest sacrifice of all. I mean, again, dollars is one thing to come by, and so I appreciate that place, but people have entrusted me and the rest of the leadership team with their lives, meaning their careers, their hours, right? Because they could be working at another startup, they could be building their own company, they could be working at Google or Medtronic or wherever else, but they said, no, we believe in what you're doing. So that's a real, that's a real responsibility that I take very seriously. And so that means I either need to be the best person in the job, or whoever is the best person for this job should be doing it, right? And so I try to remind myself of that, so that if and when that day comes that I'm not the best person for this job, at least I've intellectually understood it, even if the emotional change becomes difficult, right? The second part is, I try to think ahead to what that next role means, and I do that by surrounding myself with advisors. So something we haven't talked about, right? But I have a reasonable number of advisors, and these are folks who have gone through a lot of scaling, a lot of success, and also a lot of failure. And so, I spend a lot of time talking with those folks that are helping me with operational and strategic decisions in the company. But we'll also talk about, okay, this is where you are today, but where are you going to be in 6 months? Where are you going to be in 2 years? What do you, Kal, need to be doing to be, to make the company successful? Okay, so if the company needs that from you to be successful, what are you missing? What am I missing so that I can make the company successful, right? Okay, well, how do I go get that? Or how do I go learn that? Or who do I go talk to to navigate that? Or how do I have that awareness so when I hit those key decisions, I can tap my board or my advisors to help me through that, right? So I'm continuously in a learning mode, right? So I think, if you talk to people at Bright Insight, they'll tell you like, I'm not one to show up and say, hey, I got, I'm the smartest guy in the room. I have all the answers. Here's what everybody should do. Like, so just to be clear, right, to tell you the extreme of that, I'm running a software company, building a software company. I have never taken an engineering class in my life. I can't do Scratch with my kids, right? Like, so, so think about the context, right? So I think you have to have that. You have to constantly know that, right? And so the only thing I'm trying to be good at is a CEO. I'm not trying to be good at any other job in the company, right? And so I invest and learn just like everybody else is learning at getting better at their jobs. And if the job outgrows me, I'm intellectually ready for that. And then, I'll have advisors and others that will hopefully support me on the emotional journey of that transition.
Um, your response there was reminding me about something that my teammate Kenny Vaughn said recently. He was sort of reflecting on leaders that he's interacted with. He described it as people willing to share the mic, willing to share center stage, willing to share credit, willing, for the storyline to involve others, as it
Yeah.
of course does and will. So I think that's a really neat insight into your leadership style as well. Thank you, Kal. We have a couple of questions about sort of like the friction that comes with the regulatory realities of healthcare in the U.S. And Ryan is asking, he's saying, building a business is already difficult enough, especially without a massive lobbying budget. How do you think about regulatory issues when implementing new ideas to drive growth for the company?
Yeah, good question. So we actually started with the regulations, right? So just to, quick minute on Bright Insight, what we are is we're a regulated digital health platform. So we're all modern software stack, but we're built to the highest level of regulatory privacy, security, and quality requirements so that our customers can focus on their digital innovation and use our tech stack, to build on top of, right? So think of us as sort of AWS built specifically for regulated digital health products. So we, just like AWS lets you build any business, the cloud lets you build any business faster, better, cheaper. We do the same thing for the regulated use cases. So we actually take it on as our responsibility to deeply understand the regulations and adhere and exceed the requirements of those regulations versus try to find, we're not spending our time to figure out how to circumvent or cut corners around them. And the reason is that fundamentally, the regulations are there because they're solving for safety, right? They're there because they first and foremost are do no harm, right? And you think about it from a physician perspective, right? So I think the question is, how do you, it's not the break things innovation path. It's how do you adhere and meet this, both the spirit and of the requirements, as the regulatory requirements, as well as in intent. You meet those requirements, not just spirit and intent, but then now go innovate on top of that, right? So there's tons of space for innovation and meet the requirements at the same time. And in fact, if I would say, one thing that I think, sort of the early days of digital health got, quote unquote, got wrong, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that so much of entrepreneurs and VCs were focused on how do we innovate outside of being regulated, right? And I actually remember companies and pitches saying, "Oh, we're doing all of this stuff, and we're not even regulated by the FDA." And I sort of see it as the opposite: is the high value use cases are actually squarely in the regulated world, and the key is how do you do modern software? How do you do scalable stuff? How do you have big impact? How do you do machine learning? How do you do all these things, but within that box, right? So you got to have it starts by having a deep understanding of that box, and then melding that with what Silicon Valley is about, and so I think that actually is our secret sauce and our unique advantages is we bring incredible adherence to the most stringent requirements, but in a fully modern innovation way.
And I think the arc of your career is what made that insight possible for you. Starting
Yeah.
with massive healthcare companies and then your exposure to Silicon Valley, understanding the speed at which you could change.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I think I don't think we talk about it, but I'm a physician by education, right? So spent time in the hospital, appreciate, talk about, a hard place to innovate within, right? I mean, the hospital is harder than any big company, right? So, have that piece of appreciation, and then, growing, spending, formidable years at Novartis and Amgen, appreciate the importance of that, or appreciate that, how important it is to get that right. And companies like that, literally spend billions of dollars of their cost structure is purely to meet regulatory requirements because of patient safety, right? And we're seeing it play out right now with COVID, right? I mean, I think it's such an interesting time. Never has the modern world approved medications with so little research data, with such mass deployment of these therapies, right? And we're seeing that show up in the news every day right now, right? And sort of so such an interesting, right? And so imagine if all of drug innovation was like that, right? We're going to test everything for a couple months and then just roll it out globally, right? But we're, because of the pandemic, it's created this very interesting, risk reward dynamic that we would never take otherwise, and we shouldn't take, in my opinion.
All right, Kal, last question from us. And this is, and before we get into the question, just quick poll for our folks who are here tonight, if you'll fill that out. But Kal, it's a question from my colleague, Zane, and he's asking how becoming an entrepreneur has changed you. And I really love, as I was thinking about this question for you, I love asking it because you're an example of something that I've realized over time, which is you can be anything you want to be at any time. It's completely under your control. You decide. And I share that with BreakLiners all the time. But I'd love to hear your answer. How has this experience of starting a company changed you?
Yeah. And if we have the time, I'll sort of answer in two different ways, right? So first, building on your point around, you can, always be what you want. Absolutely believe that. Like, it's a privilege to be, in the United States, and I fully recognize not everybody, here has the same privilege, of course, and there's a lot of work that we need to do in America to, bring the aspiration of this country and make it a reality for everybody. And, I think we all have, that responsibility to support and drive that. With that said, I think, this country has a lot to offer, right? And my parents' story, obviously my story, I think, is certainly a data point around that, and a lot of other, people's stories. So what sort of building on that, like, it is much harder to accept what you and I are saying than it is. Control comes with responsibility, right? And so if you actually stop and say to yourself, it's actually my choice, that's kind of scary. You're like, well, wait a minute, I could quit my job and go do that, or I could move over there, or I could go back to school, or I could, once you actually take that on, now you can't make an excuse for the decisions you're making, right? So, I sort of encourage people to actually sort of, to do that, right? It actually is your choice, right? And I think so many of us kind of go through life in various aspects of life, and we kind of let life happen to us, instead of sort of actually realizing that we own it. And of course, look, again, people have constraints. I have constraints. Again, like I said, people, many other less fortunate folks have a lot more constraints. But I think we have to start by saying, what are the things that we can control, right? And then what are the things we want to control that we can't? So let's go figure out a way to get the control we want, right? So I think there's a philosophical or mental shift that anybody can make in any situation that they're in, right? And I'm, and obviously I don't mean that quite literally, right? Because there are unfortunately folks that are not as blessed, but I think you see the point. And then for me personally, sort of going to the entrepreneurial side, I think it's been amazing, because I think I've had this sort of continuous journey to never feel like I have a job, but I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing, right? Which is why I've had this sort of circuitous route of studying economics, but spending all my time in labs to get ready for medical school, and then like going to Boston Consulting Group, then going to medical school, then going back to Boston Consulting Group, then, so we sort of done. So I've as soon as something feels like a job, maybe that's the other answer to the CEO question from before. Certainly what will take me out of BrightInsight and go look for my next thing is when it feels like a job, right? Like if you are doing what you if your job feels more like a job than a passion, then you should seriously think about doing something else, because life is too short for that. There's so much impact to be delivered. Like, I mean, just look around us, right? There's so many problems to be solved. So like, find a thing where you're like solving the problem and it doesn't feel like a job. Now, with that said, once you find that, the risk in that is it's all consuming. The easy part of a job is you can turn it off. You're like, you know what? I don't care about that anymore. Like, I'm going to go have a glass of wine. I'm going to go play with my kids. I'm going to go do whatever. Um, Once you are in that sweet spot, it's all consuming. And when it's all consuming, it comes with its own challenges, right? But I love what I do, but it's hard to turn it off because it's exactly what I want to be doing. But of course, you need to have that self control with your family and your health and everything else. So.
Kal, what an amazing hour. Thank you so much for spending time with us. It's been such a treat to hear more about you and about Bright Insight. So appreciate your willingness to share with us.
No, it was my pleasure. I really appreciate you guys reaching out and setting up the time, and for the great questions, Bethany, and for all your guests' questions. This was a lot of fun, and I appreciate you guys getting me to pause and just reflect on some of these things. I remember in the prep, I told you, gosh, I literally have never thought about my parents and some of the ways that your questions made me think about. So when I can see them again, hopefully soon, I'll have to sit down and have some of these conversations with them.
Well, and I hope you'll share back with us when that happens. And thanks so much to you, Kal. Thanks to the whole BreakLine community for coming. Such a treat to spend the time with all of you. Hope to see you soon. Thanks
Yeah,
again,
thanks
Kal.
everyone. Best of luck, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.